Okay, welcome to our Primary Care Networks webinar. Today we're just going to look at a brief overview of the primary care networks, which will shortly start as part of the direct enhanced services. All GPs will be required to sign up to a network by the 15th of May this year if you want to become a network partner. To register as a network, you need to, you're required to give your ODS code and to identify your collective network patient list size, which should be the same list size as at the 1st of January this year. You need to map your network area. You need to enter into the core terms of the national agreement. The national agreement is made up of two parts. One is national, which is a collectively agreed set of terms, and the second is the local terms, which will need to be agreed by the 30th of June this year. You also need to nominate a clinical director who will oversee the operation of the network, and also you need to nominate a nominated payee, which will be the practice to receive the DES funding and also to distribute that funding. The commissioners will hopefully by the 31st of May then come back to each network and confirm that the registration requirements have been met. It's important to note that to have a successful registration, there needs to be a 100% coverage in your area. If there isn't, there is apparently some scope for discussion between the commissioners, the practices and the LNC. And it's also worth noting that the ideal population for a network is a minimum of 30,000 upwards. So ideally, apparently 30 to 50,000 patients. So as you probably are aware, the PCN proposes a system of more integrated and coordinated care and envisions much deeper collaboration between practices in the network. So there is pressure to grow, but do you need to be part of a network? And these are sort of issues which you need to really look at in detail now before signing up to a network agreement. There are certainly benefits to joining the network, such as shared resources, shared best practice, a coordinated approach to patient care within the network. There's increased funding available from the NHS to the network members to provide that wider range of services. The NHS long-term plan also does focus on the improvement of work-life balance within GP sort of frontline care, primary care services. And it is aimed at trying to improve the work-life balance, trying to make GPs' practices sort of happier places to work, to improve morale, and also, very importantly, for some of the smaller practices in particular, staff recruitment and retention. If you're already in a large practice or perhaps one of the super practices, and there are several throughout Kent, Sussex and Surrey, following 2-3-way mergers, you might consider that there's little to be gained by joining into or participating in a network. There is, however, the injection of funds available from the NHS, and you may bring in smaller practices who provide services that maybe you currently don't. So it still does offer some benefits. And some of the super practices in themselves may be able to register as a network. But to be a super practice, you need a minimum of 100,000 patients and above. So that's quite limited really throughout probably these regions. The PCN also promotes a much more effective use of technology. So around supported self-care models, to have a multi-professional and multi-service delivery of services using the GP practice as the primary care management centre. There are various models of how this can be delivered. So David will look at that in a few minutes. So what do you then need to consider at this point before creating the network, before signing up to any documents? As I said, the national agreement has two parts. The national terms cover issues such as the agreement, the termination arrangements, the duration, the term of the agreement, the overarching principles and objectives, exiting a member of the network either voluntarily or through expulsion, decision-making, dispute resolution, data protection and confidentiality. At a local level, the local authorities will discuss with the networks what services they want at local level. So your local terms will tend to deal more with what the community needs are. It will, of course, also have to deal with the workforce arrangements, how the services are going to be delivered, finance arrangements between the network partners, governance, decision-making, dispute resolution, data sharing, again, confidentiality, and exit arrangements from the network. So before you join a network or sign up to any documents, you do need to consider how those types of arrangements are going to work. And it really is critically important to explore those issues with your sort of proposed network partners, and to ensure that the partners in your network, that you're going to be able to work together successfully. In terms of the workforce, what you need to be looking at this stage is, do we need more people? How are we going to administer the network, or who in the network is going to administer the network requirements on a day-to-day basis? What are the operational requirements? Do we need more back office staff? Do we need more clinical staff? Who's going to employ those staff? Who is going to recruit them, be the employer? Which one of the practices in the network will employ these people? And who's going to manage them? Who's going to be responsible for supervising them? It depends on the size of the network, but if you have 5 or 10 practices within your network, that needs very careful consideration, and also agreement around who takes the lead for responsibility on that, if that's the way you're going to operate. Some of the models propose a joint employment contract where all network members would employ all of the new staff needed for the administration of new services under the network. We think that that's quite a complex arrangement. It would be difficult to manage. There are issues still with the appointment of a paymaster and also a HR member to deal with management and supervision. There are also some VAT issues with that type of model and subcontracting, particularly which may cause tax issues. So David will touch on that briefly when he looks at the structures. The PCN is also required to appoint a clinical director. That's a compulsory requirement, as well as a clinical pharmacist and a social prescriber. The NHS will provide funding for those roles on a 70-30 basis. The clinical director has to be either a GP or a clinically qualified person. Looking at then finance, again, it's a very important role. It's very important. There has to be a lot of trust within the network about who is going to be the nominated payee. What accountability will there be to the other network members in terms of finance? Who will report to the wider network on financial issues? If you're going to be the practice that is the nominated payee, do you need further back office staff? There'll be additional administration costs for the claims that you need to make, the receipt and distribution of funds. You'll also have issues around a bank account. Will the network have a separate bank account, or how will that operate? These are all issues to be considered for your local terms of your network agreement. Governance and decision-making is also very important between the parties to the network agreement. There has to be voting rights have to be considered. So the options are, do you have one vote per practice, or if you're in a mixture of different sizes of practices, do you have a weighted voting system? So larger practices get more votes, smaller practices get less. What happens if you can't reach an agreement? What processes would be required then? So these are issues to consider, again, for the formal network agreement. The network agreement and in operation really will need to be fluid and a little bit flexible. There will be compromises to be made. And the proposals are that the NHS will expand the networks year on year. So there will need to be some flexibility to allow for that. The objectives of your network also need to be really clear, and that's something to agree at the outset with your other partners so that you don't have difficulties or too many difficulties later in the future as part of your decision-making process. So the vision of the network needs to be very clear. Also, dispute resolution and exit arrangements. You need to ensure that there are processes in place to get partners out of your network if they're not cooperating with you, they're not processing work as they should be. It may be that partners fall out and parties need to be removed. There's also the option, of course, for a partner to voluntarily leave the network if they wish to do so. Again, needing to give consideration to how that's going to operate, the timings involved. Very importantly, data sharing and confidentiality. GDPR obviously continues to apply in terms of data protection and our patient confidentiality. It may be that the network will need to appoint its own data protection officer to overarch the other practices, to create a policy or procedure on data sharing, data confidentiality. Are your IT systems compatible to ensure secure and safe transfer of data or data sharing? So those are all issues that you need to think about in terms of the network agreement at a local level. It is important, there is increased use of technology intended as part of the network. So it is looking at the systems within your existing network to ensure that compatibility. Once you've agreed that kind of framework with your partners, you can then look to register your network with the commissioners and then move on to complete, looking at drafting and finalising your local agreement. Other issues to also very briefly to look at are, at that point, looking at the patient list size, how manageable that is. NHS pensions, some of the models that David will talk about are not actually compatible with NHS pension, so that's a potential problem with some of the models. And also insurance. If you're part of a bigger list, there's bigger risk, so your practices may need to talk to insurance brokers about any changes in terms of insurance requirements. Before I hand you over to David, I just thought I would outline very briefly how we can help you with all of this. We can provide advice on which is the best network for your practice, what the options are for the various different models, and we can also assist with the network agreements, with the employment contracts, and with any subcontracting contractual arrangements that you might need as well. So we're happy to talk to you individually about any needs that you have there. So David is now going to have a chat with you about the structures and the legal structures that you need to put in place for the networks.
Okay, yes. So picking up just lastly on the data sharing, I understand that the NHS is going to be bringing out a standard agreement on that side. So that's one agreement that we're waiting to be issued, and perhaps if they're going, we're also asking whether there are other standards to come out. But turning to the structures, there are basically 5 structures that could be used for these PCNs. They're called the flat practice structure, the lead provider, the federation, and the super practice, and the non-GP employer. Now, in practice, there is likely only the best two options for most people in this region are going to be either the flat practice option or the lead provider option. The federation has attractions from a legal point of view, but we understand that there are very big VAT issues involved, and the super practice is really only applicable to those partnerships that have over 100,000 or more patients on their list, so only the very large practices. And we're not aware of many people thinking about the non-GP employer option. One practice, perhaps, one area perhaps was using a community trust, thinking of using a community trust for that. So the first and probably the favoured option is what they call the flat practice network. And this is basically where you get a number of practices coming together. They will require, and effectively they will have a network agreement. One practice will be the nominated payee and receive the funding, but all the liabilities are spread across the partnership, the practices, they will need shared employment contracts, which Judith touched on earlier. This is a slightly unusual arrangement for employers because each practice becomes the employer of these people. So they'll have, if there's 4 practices, you strictly have 4 employers, although one is likely to, the nominated payee is likely to be the one that sort of administers the grievance and disciplinary and acts as a sort of nominated employer, if you like. So that's the first form of structure, and this is really where all the practices are, if you like, participants in a sort of network or framework agreement, collaboration arrangement, all equally taking on those liabilities. Obviously, there's unlimited liability in this model, so all the liabilities of the PCN flows through to all the practices equally, and they'll be jointly and severally liable. Now, in your network agreement, you may seek to share these liabilities differently, but the basic legal position is that all of them will be liable. The other favoured option is likely to be what they call the lead provider option, where basically you have, again, a group of practices working together. There will be some sort of framework arrangement between them, but the lead practice will take on all the PCN staff, so they will be the sole employer and will basically do all the work involved in it. Now, you'll still have a network agreement so that the other practices can oversee how the PCN is administered, and to set out how difficulties can be managed. And the same issues will apply as to voting rights and appointments of a management committee and so forth. But in this structure, the lead practice takes the main role and has the main burden of the work as well. Now, we are aware, we're not tax advisors, but we are aware that one aspect of this is that the lead practice will be deemed to be providing services to the other practices within the PCN. So there will be a VAT issue in the sense that how the services provision is structured could give rise to a VAT liability, and that's something that you would need to take tax advice with your accountants on. I'll just touch on the other models more briefly, because they're less likely to be applicable. But the federation provider imagines a sort of limited liability vehicle being set up by the different practices, and there it's easier from a sort of administration point of view, and it has advantages from the legal perspective because all the employees are employed by the limited liability vehicle, so they are separate from the partnerships that are forming the PCN, and there is limited liability for the employment contracts. The limited liability company is their employer, and that's clear. There is with companies, there is a sort of body of legislation about how meetings are held and voting and appointing directors or boards. So there is that background to how these things are administered. So it does have advantages from a company point, a legal point of view, but we understand there are significant VAT issues involved in that kind of practice. The super practice model, again, could work for a few practices where they're quite large and they will just apply for PCN status and then administer the practice in a very similar way to how they run their partnerships. And then the non-GP provider employer model envisages a a community trust or similar providing the workforce, which then provides the services to the parts of the primary care network. That's my summary of those things.
All right. I think we have a couple of questions, and if you want to ask any questions, please do send them through to us. We're happy to deal with those. One of the questions that we have been asked is around bank accounts. As David said, you have various options in terms of the structure, and whoever would be the nominated payee practice is presumably the one who would hold the bank account. If you went for the option of the limited liability entity, then presumably it would be the entity which holds the bank account. And as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, that then comes into your local network agreement in terms of governance of that financial arrangement and what the accountability is to the other partners of the financial arrangements for the network. I think we had one other question as well, which was excluding members from the network and whether that's possible. It will be possible, and it is intended within the agreements. Both the formal national guidelines do have core principles around termination and exclusion of or expulsion of members. And again, locally, at a local level, you would, as you do in your partnership agreements, have scope to remove a partner or expel a partner voluntarily or otherwise through the agreements. And as I've said, we're very happy to discuss the requirements with you individually. So please do contact either myself or David if you want some further information, or if you need sort of advice or assistance with the agreements or the models that you're considering for your practices. So I think we don't seem to have any other questions. Let me just, sorry, I just have to check. And all right, so we have one other question. So is a limited company federation model possible without an APMS contract? So that's a question that we've got. So the limited company federation model. So David, I think if you could think about that.
Yes, I believe that it would be. Let me just, but I'd need to check on that.
Okay, well, maybe David can come back to you separately on that, but we do think it's possible without the APMS contract. So are there any other questions at all? We've still got about a minute or two to go if anyone's got any other questions they would like to submit. So I don't think we've got any other questions. Just have to check. All right. Okay. As I say, if you do have any other questions, then please do let us know. We're always happy to have a chat about it. And thank you for joining the webinar today.